Locke on Legitimate Government and Rebellion, Lecture 2. So, in the last lecture, we talked about the limits of legislative power and also about the separation of powers, the need to separate the legislative from the executive power. In this second and final lecture about these readings, I'm going to talk about a couple things. One is this power that Locke refers to as prerogative, and I'm going to distinguish prerogative from tyranny. And then the second thing that we're going to talk about is the right to rebellion, which comes in chapter 19. So once we get through that, we will have gotten through all the basics of Locke's political theory that is relevant for this course. So remember, the official designation of the executive is really the executive, which in our system is the president, and other systems might be a king or a prime minister. But the official sort of job description of an executive is that they are there to execute the laws made by the legislature, right? Which can make the executive look very subordinate in a lot of ways, right? That for the most part, the executive is carrying out things dictated by the legislature. But at the same time, as Locke had mentioned, oftentimes since executing the law involves using the force of the community, right? It involves creating agencies that do things like collect taxes, enforce laws, and also investigate and punish crimes and all that kind of stuff. You know, that the execution of the law requires the use of the force of the community. And because of that, the executive is oftentimes also the one who exercises what Locke calls the federative power. Or in other words, the executive tends to be the one that is in charge of foreign policy, both in terms of sort of military, war and peace, but also just diplomacy and such things. So the executive also tends to be in charge of foreign policy. And in that area, although we don't really get into it here, that's an area where actually the executive has quite a bit of discretion. Right, that obviously the legislature can set limits on aspects of foreign policy, but a lot of times it is the executive that really has the power of initiative when it comes to foreign relations. But then there is also this thing that Locke refers to as prerogative. And these are defined, prerogative is defined in sections 160 and in 166. And in the basic sense, what prerogative is the power of the executive to serve the public good at discretion without guidance by the law, and sometimes contrary to the law. Here's the way that Locke sets it up, starting with section 159. Where the legislative and executive power are in distinct hands, as they are in all moderated monarchies and well-framed governments, there the good of the society requires that several things should be left to the discretion of him that has the executive power. Discretion meaning he can act according to his judgment. He doesn't simply have to act according to rules. To act at discretion means you can follow your own judgment in those areas. For the legislators, not being able to foresee and provide by laws for all that may be useful to the community, the executor of the laws, having the power in his hands, has by the common law of nature a right to make use of it for the good of the society. In many cases where the municipal law has given no direction, till the legislative can conveniently be assembled to provide for it. And many things there are which the law can by no means provide for, and those must necessarily be left to the discretion of him that has the executive power in his hands, to be ordered by him as the public good and advantage shall require. Nay, it is fit that the laws themselves should, in some cases, give way to the executive power, or rather to this fundamental law of nature and government, namely, that as much as may be, all the members of the society are to be preserved. So we'll just pause there for a second, then we'll get into his argument. But the basic idea here is that, the fundamental job of government is to serve the public good. It's to preserve the society and to protect the life, liberty, and property of the citizens, and to preserve as many of the citizens as possible. So that's the primary responsibility of government. The ordinary way that is done is through the making and enforcing of laws. But it isn't always the case that laws are adequate. There might be times when, for example, as he says, there aren't laws. And here, to give a somewhat equivalent example, in American history, you've probably all heard of Louisiana Purchase, when Thomas Jefferson purchased the Louisiana Territory from France. Now, technically, when Jefferson did this, he wasn't authorized to do it. Congress under the Constitution is the one that authorizes the expenditure of money. The executive cannot independently commit the United States to pay a certain amount to a foreign power. So Jefferson wanted, as I recall, Jefferson wanted to get the authorization of Congress, but the things were moving so quickly that basically he had to act before Congress was going to be able to assemble and officially, allow for it. So he just went ahead and did it. And obviously, once Congress had a chance, Congress was fine with it. Nobody saw him as abusing his power. He did something that would have been approved of. It's just that in that particular situation, where this purchase, which was by sort of common consent, was for the public good of the United States, was not actually authorized by law. But Jefferson went ahead and did it anyways, and it was a good thing. But when he did that, he was acting on what Locke would call prerogative. He was acting for the public good in a situation where there was no law that he was enforcing. And so sometimes when that happens, in some of these circumstances, then, the legislature, if you have a kind of an unprecedented circumstance, some of the things with the development of digital technology and all that, where, the government has to act even when there aren't laws yet because you're dealing with a novel situation. A lot of times then Congress can come along and make laws or adjust existing laws in order to account for these unprecedented situations. And then at that point, then the executive just goes back to executing what the legislature says. But as Locke notes, aside from situations where there is no law, there are two other situations where prerogative might be called for. And recall, prerogative, as he defines it in section 160, is the power to act according to discretion for the public good without the prescription of the law and sometimes even against it. Right, that's prerogative. So alongside situations where there is no law yet, as he mentions, a second circumstance is that sometimes it is impossible that there be a law. And here I'm thinking of things like national emergencies. When there's a national emergency, say an invasion or something like September 11th, the executive just has to act. The executive can't sit and wait for Congress to tell him precisely what to do. He's got to act. And so, in a sense, that's a situation where you're dealing with something like prerogative. I mean, it's a little bit more complicated than that because Congress can obviously authorize the president to act at his discretion. But, Locke's basic argument here is that there are going to be times in emergency circumstances where the executive is just going to have to do what's for the public good. And you're not always going to know when those emergencies will come or what they entail, because that's the very nature of an emergency, is that it's kind of unprecedented or unexpected. So alongside from situations where there is no existing law, there are also situations like emergencies where kind of law doesn't apply, but the executive has to act for the public good. And the third circumstance where prerogative is called for, according to Locke, is that there might be circumstances where acting strictly according to the law might actually be contrary to the public good. That even though the law in general might be good for the society, there might be some circumstances where acting strictly according to the law would be damaging. And in those circumstances, Locke argues that the executive is actually authorized in the name of the public good to act contrary to what the laws dictate. And Locke actually gives an example of this third circumstance where the executive can act contrary to the law, right where I left off in section 159. This is on page 62. He says, "For since many accidents may happen wherein a strict and rigid observation of the laws may do harm, as not to pull down an innocent man's house to stop the fire when the next to it is burning, and a man may come sometimes within the reach of the law, which makes no distinction of persons, by an action that may deserve reward and pardon, 'tis fit the ruler should have a power in many cases to mitigate the severity of the law and pardon some offenders. For the end of government being the preservation of all, as much as may be, even the guilty are to be spared where it can prove no prejudice to the innocent." End of quotation. So in other words, he gives that example, like let's say there's a fire moving through a neighborhood, and so some people start tearing down, you've got the fire in the house right here, and so people start tearing down the house next to it. Now, strictly speaking, you're destroying that person's property. You have no right to do that. You have no right to tear somebody else's house down. So strictly speaking, that's illegal. But this is a circumstance where Locke says, well, actually, but people who do that deserve to be pardoned. They shouldn't be punished for doing that because they're actually doing something for the public good. They're trying to stop the spread of this fire. And so this would be an example where if you strictly approve the law, you would punish anybody who did that as a destroyer of property. But in fact, as he says, that person deserves, in a certain sense, the thanks of the society because he arrested the spread of the fire to further houses. So, and this is at the root, actually, in the Constitution of the United States, there's no mention of anything like a prerogative power, but it is the case that the president has the power to pardon. So that the president can pardon people for crimes committed, and that is something that is done. That's an example of prerogative where you've had somebody has through a regular fair trial been found liable for having broken some law, and the president basically either remits the punishment or wipes it from the books. So the pardoning power is a prerogative power. Its original rationale is that sometimes the strict application of the law is contrary to the public good. And in those circumstances, the president or the executive should have the power to kind of, ignore the law in the name of the public good. But now, obviously, this can be kind of a dangerous power. It's justified by the law of nature because obviously the law of nature as applied to societies is that the society ought to be preserved as much as possible. And so when acting in the absence of the law or contrary to the law is to the public good, then it's justified. It's just that under normal circumstances, that's not the case. Under normal circumstances, you want the executive just executing the laws. But where the law doesn't exist or is inadequate, the executive should act according to discretion. But obviously, it's a dangerous power because it can set precedents for abuses of power. People can say, well, hey, look, you let this guy do whatever he wanted, so I should have the right to do whatever he wanted too. So prerogative is kind of necessary because of the limits of law, that laws just can't foresee everything and apply to everything. So prerogative is necessary because of the limits of the law, but it's dangerous. And so as much as possible, you want to rely upon rule of law. Now, the evil twin, so to speak, of prerogative is tyranny, which he describes in section 199 on page 63. This is after talking about usurpation. So usurpation is when somebody who does not have the right to rule seizes the right to rule. So you could think of something like Henry IV in the way that he seizes power from Richard II. That would be an example of usurpation. So Locke says, as usurpation is the exercise of power which another hath a right to, so tyranny is the exercise of power beyond right, which nobody can have a right to. And this is making use of the power anyone has in his hands, not for the good of those who are under it, but for his own private, separate advantage. When the governor, however entitled, makes not the law but his will the rule, and his commands and actions are not directed to the preservation of the properties of his people, but to the satisfaction of his own ambition, revenge, covetousness, or any other irregular passion. That's tyranny. So tyranny is like prerogative in that it's arbitrary in the sense that you're acting at discretion. You're not acting according to a rule, you're acting according to your will. The difference between prerogative and tyranny is that prerogative is acting at discretion for the public good, whereas tyranny is acting at discretion, but for one's own advantage and at the expense of the community that you govern. So that's tyranny. So this kind of classic definition of tyranny is when those with political power use that power to benefit themselves at the expense of those that they rule, as opposed to using their power for the benefit of those that they rule. And for those of you who've read Plato's Republic, you might remember in Book 1 where Socrates says that, a ruler in the precise sense, or a true ruler, rules for the good of those who are under his authority. Right? Political power is there for the good of those who are under that power. So when that power is instead abused and used to harm the community, because of the selfishness or greed or whatever of the ruler, that's tyranny. And tyranny leads to chapter 19, which is his discussion of the dissolution of government. That is, those circumstances wherein the people are entitled to dissolve, to reject, to rebel against, and to replace their own government. And this is obviously something that that Hobbes did not believe people had the right to do. Remember, for Hobbes, the sovereign power is absolute. So once you have agreed to obey the sovereign, you have to obey the sovereign, period. The only circumstances, according to Hobbes, when you don't have to obey is if the sovereign is actually, directly attacking you. And when the sovereign is directly attacking you, you have a right to fight back. Or if the sovereign orders you to endanger your life, you have a right to resist doing that. So for Hobbes, self-preservation wins out. For Locke, there's a broader case, though. Locke really argues that governments can render themselves unworthy of the allegiance of those that they govern. And under those circumstances, the governed have the right to rebel. So this is this question of, when is resistance to government justified? Hobbes would say never, more or less, but Locke disagrees. Government exists to secure the life, liberty, and property of the people who live under it. So whenever a government is clearly no longer doing this, is failing to protect the life, liberty, and property of citizens, or is actively harming the citizens deliberately and by design in their life, liberty, and property, under those circumstances, you have a right to alter or to abolish the government. And this is what he discusses in chapter 19. Now, the section 222, which is at the top of page 64, is a very clear statement of this. He says, the reason why men enter into society is the preservation of their property. And remember, property here he means in the extended sense, not just the protection of your possessions, but the protection of your life, your liberty, and your possessions. That's what property in the general sense refers to. So the reason why men enter into society is the preservation of their property, i.e. their life, liberty, and possessions. And the end why they choose and authorize a legislative is that there may be laws made and rules set as guards and fences to the properties of all the members of the society, to limit the power and moderate the dominion of every part and member of the society. So general rules so that everybody respects everybody else, so that people don't harm each other. For since it can never be supposed to be the will of the society that the legislative should have a power to destroy that which everyone designs to secure by entering into society, and for which the people submitted themselves to the legislators of their own making, whenever the legislators endeavor to take away and destroy the property of the people, or to reduce them to slavery under arbitrary power, they put themselves into a state of war with the people, who are thereupon absolved from any farther obedience, and are left to the common refuge which God hath provided for all men against force and violence. Right? So in other words, you could not suppose that a people institute a government so that that government will exploit them. That is irrational and stupid. Right? Government is instituted to protect the people. Right? And so and he talks about the legislative here because remember, the legislature is the primary branch. It's the one that makes the laws. So if you find that your legislature, instead of preserving the property of citizens and their rights, is actually trying to destroy their property or to reduce them to a condition of slavery, you have a right to resist. As Locke says, whensoever, therefore, the legislative shall transgress this fundamental rule of society, and either by ambition, fear, folly, or corruption, endeavor to grasp themselves or put into the hands of any other an absolute power over the lives, liberties, and estates of the people. By this breach of trust, they forfeit the power the people put into their hands for quite contrary ends, and it devolves to the people, who have a right to resume their original liberty, and by the establishment of a new legislative, such as they shall think fit, provide for their own safety and security, which is the end for which they are in society. So end of quotation. You'll notice there are some echoes in the Declaration of Independence. So when the government becomes destructive of the lives, liberties, and properties of the people, the government, by design, the government forfeits its right to rule. Now note, in sections 223 through 225, and then again in section 230, Locke notes that people are not usually eager to exercise this power. they're often willing to put up with a lot of discomfort and abuses of power rather than do something as drastic as revolt, right? And that's why you don't find, large-scale revolutions were not particularly common in history. People are inclined to suffer rather than to act. As he says on page 225, in section 230, right, it says, "Nor let anyone say that mischief can arise from hence as often as it shall please a busy head or a turbulent spirit to desire the alteration of the government." So in other words, he says, somebody might say, whoa, Locke, teaching people that they have the right to rebel against the government is really dangerous, right? Because now people can use that as a pretext for stirring up trouble anytime they just don't like what the government's doing, right? Oh, the taxes, I think the taxes are too high, so revolution, right? Or I don't like these laws, so revolution, right? So, people are saying, isn't there a potential for this right to rebel to be abused so that people invoke it not when there is actually a case of tyranny, but just simply when they don't like what the government's doing? And Locke says, "For till the mischief be grown general, and the ill design of the rulers become visible, or their attempts sensible to the greater part, the people who are more disposed to suffer than right themselves by resistance are not apt to stir." So in other words, Locke thinks, just as a kind of like psychological and historical observation, that for the most part, kind of the common people, ordinary citizens, are, if anything, not protective enough of their rights. They actually put up with more abuse than they should, rather than being prone to stir up trouble where it's not justified. So Locke does not think that this right to rebel is a dangerous doctrine that will be abused. But when the government is acting badly in a tyrannical way, Locke thinks absolutely, at that point, yes, stir up trouble, right? Because the government's already at war with you. At that point, your duty is to fight back and get yourself a better government. And again, Locke's not saying it's not just any one bad decision or any one bad act that justifies revolution. As he says in section 225, section 225, such revolutions happen not upon every little mismanagement in public affairs, great mistakes in the ruling part, many wrong and inconvenient laws, and all the slips of human frailty will be borne by the people without mutiny or murmur. But if a long train of abuses, prevarications, and artifices, all tending the same way, make the design visible to the people, and they cannot but feel what they lie under and see whither they are going, 'tis not to be wondered that they should then rouse themselves and endeavor to put the rule into such hands which may secure to them the ends for which government was first erected. So a long train of abuses, a clear design. So in other words, people put up with a lot of bad decisions, even some abuses of power. But if you look at how the government is acting, and you can say the only way that we can interpret all these various things that the government's been doing is that they're all aimed at, oppressing us. That's when people will be roused, when they see that the government's, it's not by accident, but it's by design that the government is doing these bad things that it's doing. And that's why, for example, you have in the Declaration of Independence a long list of charges against the King of Great Britain. That's the part of the Declaration people tend not to read. But you have a list of various abuses that the British government is charged with having done to the Americans. And that's in fitting kind of with this Lockean notion where they're trying to say, we are not declaring independence just on some light pretext, but rather we have put up with a long train of abuses whose clear design is to render us into a position of complete submission to the British government. And so under this circumstance where this destructive design has been revealed, now we invoke our right to leave and establish our own government. So when the government has clearly become tyrannical, revolt is justified, right? That's Locke's basic argument. And with that right to revolt, we really arrive at the last element of Locke's philosophy that is relevant for our course. So we've gotten the state of nature, the law of nature, natural equality, natural liberty, the natural right to property, the need for government to be based on consent, the purpose of government being the protection of the life, liberty, and property of the people. The limits on legislative power, that legislative power cannot be destructive of the public good and cannot be arbitrary. We've gotten the argument that the need to separate the legislative and executive power so that you don't have arbitrary government, so the people who make the rules are not the same as the people who enforce the rules, so that you can have rule of law. We've gotten the need for prerogative, the danger of tyranny, and the right to revolt. And with that, we've gone through the basics of Locke. So, but one last parting thing. As I mentioned several lectures ago, it would be wrong to think that the American founders were simply picking up Locke and framing the American government by applying Locke to American circumstances. Locke is a very important intellectual and philosophical source of the American founding, especially Locke's notion of natural rights. But nonetheless, the American founding is a product of much more than just John Locke. And so in the next set of lectures, we'll be talking about some other elements that contributed to the American founding, and in particular, the political heritage that the colonists brought from England, the way that politics was practiced and understood in England. And we'll also talk about the influence of the Puritans and of religion on American politics, so that we can get a slightly more adequate picture of the major streams that fed into the American founding. So that will be next time.